Welcome to the ANU and thank you for coming here today to celebrate and honour the life of Professor Tony McMichael, AO. I especially welcome Judith and other members of Tony's family to the university this afternoon. I know that I speak for many members of the ANU community when I say that the passing of Tony was deeply saddening for all of us. Many words have been said and written about Tony over recent weeks by his former students, colleagues, staff and friends. That he was a first-class epidemiologist, a pioneer in the field of population health and climate change, an internationally recognised scientist and a visionary. And indeed, he was all of these things. But for many here at ANU, he was also a generous mentor, an exceptional teacher, and above all else, a great friend. ANU was honoured to have a man of Tony's calibre, intellect, and character at the university for more than a decade. His contribution to evidence-based research and the effects of climate change on human beings were regarded as extraordinary by so many of his peers, both here in Australia and indeed around the world. Today we come together as a community to honour and celebrate his work, his life, and his enormous contribution to ANU. The Master of Ceremonies for today is Dr. Richard Dennis. Richard is a prominent Australian economist, author, and public policy commentator. He is the Executive Director of the Australia Institute and was formerly an Adjunct Associate Professor in the Crawford School of Public Policy here at ANU. Without further ado, can I please invite Richard to commence the formal proceedings.
Thank you, Professor Young. We're here today to celebrate the life and work, and more importantly, perhaps, the lasting impact of my good friend, Professor Tony McMichael. Sorry. As Professor Young just said, my name's Richard Dennis and I'm the Executive Director of the Australia Institute. And it's with very mixed feelings that I'm here today to help celebrate something as sad as the passage of Professor McMichael, or Tony, as I think almost everybody called him. I was always amazed when I spoke to Tony or talked to people who I didn't even know Tony, just how broad his network was, how broad his interests were, and how deep the sentiment that so many people across so many disciplines felt towards Tony. I hope today that we all learn something else about Tony. I've already learnt that he once had a bad moustache. He didn't have that in my time, and I'm kind of glad. But no doubt Judith at one point found it quite charming. My wife never found my moustache rather charming. Today is, I think a lot of people in here will have mixed feelings, but again, it's so important that we remember what Tony has done and what he meant to us, and reflect on what individuals can do if they turn their mind to it. I'd now like to introduce a short video presentation by Professor Fiona Stanley, AC. Fiona is known to many of you, made a wonderful contribution herself to so many of the fields that Tony was interested in, and indeed in preparing for today I learnt that Fiona had a stamp made of her. I didn't know that about Fiona. Tony may have had a stamp. I didn't know if he did. So without any further ado, let me hand over to the video, and then we're going to hear from a number of people who played an important part in Tony's life, who played an important part in working with Tony on the vast array of enormous issues that he's worked on, and hopefully at the end of today's session you can join us for some refreshments and we can reflect more informally. We have four speakers, a number of short reflections, and there'll be, as I said, some afternoon tea and refreshments afterwards.
I feel very honoured to have been asked to speak at this memorial event for Tony McMichael, and I'm very sorry that I actually can't be there in person. I was devastated to hear of the death of Tony, the gentle giant of epidemiology in Australia and around the world, and I send my sympathy to all of you, his friends and colleagues, but particularly to Judith and the girls, and I hope that today's ceremony is a fitting time for acknowledging Tony's contribution. It's tragic that he's died at a time when his unique contributions are urgently needed in Australia and internationally. Starting as an environmental epidemiologist way back, he's now grown to use epidemiology for the big planetary issues that are facing us today. He was influenced by the friend of my late father, the philosopher-biologist René Dubos, and I can see now that the influence of René on Tony has been of seminal importance. He has made a huge contribution to the health and well-being of Australians. I well remember the results of the Port Pirie study with the effects of lead on children's brains, and that led to the reduction of lead in petrol. A fantastically cost-effective way of using epidemiology, his work on passive smoking, and I could go on. But I guess the thing that really has given us a sense of the greatness of Tony McMichael is using his skills and knowledge and wisdom. He took on the concept of planetary overload. So this is much more than the health effects of climate change. This was about excessive population, excessive consumption, excessive production of waste, and excessive degradation of the environment, but culminating in this very pointy end of the health effects of what was happening to our planet. Now, this is an incredibly challenging area, very big picture, complex problem, but it was really, I guess, five things that made it so particularly challenging. It actually criticises the very rationale of our GDP-driven world, desperately seeking more growth as a measure of its success. So there's Tony confronting, if you like, the rationale for existence of so many countries. Secondly, it's very difficult for the data. You know, it's complex. We have to model it, we have to predict. And so this is a very complex and challenging data issue for any epidemiologist. Thirdly, there are huge vested interests who do not want us to succeed, to get the changes that are required to preserve the planet. Fourthly, it's politically polarising. And once the politicians get hold of these issues, these big issues, the science tends to go out the window. And what's the implementation strategy? It's extremely hard, again, extremely complex, multifaceted. But here was our Australian world champion. Tony McMichael was literally spearheading much of this work way back before any of us were even aware of the health effects of climate change. And he continued to do that until the day he died. In fact, only the week before he died, we wrote a letter together, a group of us, an open letter to the Prime Minister published in the Medical Journal of Australia. So I have some lovely images of Tony McMichael for you. Tony speaking at a public health meeting in Canberra. I remember at a public health meeting in Adelaide, him playing the violin with Anna and Celia as part of the entertainment during the interval of the dinner, with this marvellous Renaissance man, you might say. I remember having a wonderful dinner with Judith and Tony in Adelaide. Again, a warm host, wonderful conversation in a beautiful environment. And I remember Tony and I presenting to Kevin Rudd on the Prime Minister's Science, Engineering and Innovation Council on the health effects of climate change, and feeling that we had really engaged that council only to find out 2 weeks later that Rudd had decided to put everything on the back burner. How devastating that was, but Tony didn't give up. So I'd like to salute our outstanding scientist, scholar, friend, academic leader, and we are all diminished by the loss of Tony McMichael, but we must continue the fight. We must actually not let him down as well as the planet down. Again, thank you so much for asking me to be part of this, even if it's done remotely. And I wish all of you very well, and particularly Judith and the family. Thank you.
To that end, let me introduce our next speaker. One of Tony's obvious passions, a passion that so many of us perhaps here shared with him, was that of climate change. So of course I think it's fitting that one of the many roles that Tony filled was of a founding board member and indeed continuing board member for the duration of its life and his of the Climate Institute. Our next speaker is John Connor, the Executive Director of the Climate Institute, who is going to talk a bit about that element of Tony's work. John, please.
Thank you, Richard. Judith, Anna, Celia, Vice-Chancellor, I am too honoured to be asked to say a few words about Tony, who, as Richard said, is a founding member and a member of the board. To me, Tony was a giant of spirit, a pioneering global citizen, and a good, if not fiercely competitive, sportsman. Thinking of this giant made me think of another giant of the ANU, Professor Manning Clark, and his bold division of humanity into enlargeners and straighteners. For Tony was an enlargener. Gareth Evans applied this division to the field of international relations, so I'm sure I can do that for Tony. He consistently and tenaciously fought to transcend humanity's petty tribalism for a greater vision of equitable well-being and excellence. His was the civilising and passionate spirit of a global citizen. It was a shame Tony wasn't around for the last couple of months because he would have enjoyed them. Perhaps his indomitable spirit in some way assisted them. I think Tony would have delighted in how the ANU has been steadfast in the endowment's fossil fuel divestment decision, investing as if the future mattered now. Divestment efforts are connected to a deeper and more profound change underway in the nature of global capitalism. Some call this the emergence of a fiduciary replacing financial capitalism. Others call it the rise of checks and balances in an emerging civil economy. Whatever, but both relate to the opportunities that arise from the unprecedented power institutional investors with long-term responsibility now have to challenge the chronic short-termism so driving so many of our current ills. In the 90s, Asians crisis, these funds, superannuation funds, insurance funds, sovereign wealth funds, owned about 15% of the global stock exchange. But now they own over 50% and can be active and should be active owners with regard to the longer-term responsibilities of our nest eggs of superannuation, but endowments for places such as the ANU. Tony was a great supporter of our work, pioneering greater disclosure of climate and carbon risks, and also in enabling fund members to engage their superannuation funds and Vice-Chancellor students to engage their universities in pursuit of better activities in this regard. Tony would have been proud of the steadfastness that the ANU has shown in the face of a shocked political and economic incumbency. As a great appreciator and applicator of irony, Tony would have enjoyed the semi-farcical events around the G20 and climate change. As Fiona said, one of his last public acts was to write to the Prime Minister to have climate change and its health as well as economic impacts on the agenda. Now, money couldn't buy a better education campaign, and that was something Tony was passionate about, education campaigns, than that generated by the current government's current obstinacy regarding climate change. The events around the G20 demonstrated clearly to millions of Australians that world leaders do make the link between climate change and economic prosperity. What could have been managed quietly with the same benign paragraph in the final communique was magnified by the theatre of resistance, followed by a possible repentance, and yet further resistance. But I think what Tony would have most enjoyed is the way that economic and public health impacts of fossil fuel pollution is increasingly being fused with climate action in driving a richer agenda of the co-benefits of action. It's this fusion of public and economic health that's a key driver behind, for example, the US and China climate partnership, and of course a fusion that Tony pioneered within a number of key dimensions. His innovative research linking human health with impactors like climate change and lead would have been sufficient for many. But Tony also invested his time and energy in altering the social and political landscape to help deliver the changes these research outcomes demanded. The breadth of his supports for organisations from the Australia Institute to the Climate and Health Alliance to the Climate Institute, as well as his mentoring and counselling of many, many students, is breathtaking. How he managed to do so and have the time to raise such a brilliant and creative family is astounding. Amongst that, he also found time for his sport. At Tony's funeral, my chair, Mark Wootton, recounted how we battled Tony and another into the dark on a tennis court, but his wile and guile ultimately bested our energetic endeavours and he won out. The Climate Institute is honoured to be asked to establish a memorial fund in his name to further his passion to tell the story of the human impacts of climate change, and it's hopefully appropriate that the first project we are working on with the support of this fund is one on climate change and sport. Watch this space. Finally, in researching this speech, I came across a quote from Mark Twain on the death of a corrupt politician. He said, "I refused to attend his funeral, but I wrote a letter saying I approved of it." My feeling for Tony is obviously the reverse. He's passed away from us way too soon. As it happens, I couldn't attend his funeral because I was in New York for the UN Climate Summit, but I'm so privileged to attend, let alone address this memorial to his work. Thank you, Tony. I hope the work we do honours your giant spirit, your global citizenship, and your good but tenacious sportsmanship. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We're now going to hear from Tony himself, so get your hankies ready.
I'm Tony McMichael. I'm the Professor of Population Health at the Australian National University in Canberra, Australia. And I'm here to write a book, or to at least to draft a book. The title is When Climates Change, Famines, Fevers and the Fates of Populations. And it's an attempt to tell a long historical story about human experience in response to changing climate over the ages. Well, my project is really inspired, in a sense, by some frustration that I've been registering over the last decade or so as somebody who, immodestly, has been a leader internationally in developing research on the topic of climate change and the risks currently and particularly in the future to human health. But the public discussion about climate change has got bogged down pretty much in the immediacies. The economic consequences, the impacts on industries and jobs, risks to physical infrastructure, concerns about iconic species, polar bears, Great Barrier Reef and so on, all very important. But we don't seem to have made the connections, connect the dots and realise that all of these sorts of changes ultimately, if not currently, present risks to the future of human health, food supplies, fresh water supplies, stability of infectious disease patterns, protection against extreme weather events, and social stability, as a basis for well-being and reasonable mental health, as opposed to the consequences of displacement and disruption and conflict. So we don't seem to have got to the point of understanding the stakes we're really playing for with human-induced climate change. So it's increasingly seemed to me that it would be useful to look back and ask the big question about how humans have fared in the past in response to naturally occurring climate change. And there I'm a bit lucky because climate does vary naturally and has made a number of short-term, long-term fluctuations over the last 10,000 years. So there's an interesting record of that changing exposure to climate, and increasingly, as we move from the long distant past towards the future, quite a good record of human health outcomes. So I'll be attempting to put those together. I'm Tony McMichael. I'm the Professor of Population Health at the Australian National University in Canberra, Australia. And I'm here to write a book, or at least to draft a book. The title is When Climates Change, Famines, Fevers and the Fates of Populations. And it's an attempt to tell a long historical story about human experience in response to changing climate over the ages. Well, my project is really inspired, in a sense, by some frustration that I've been registering over the last decade or so as somebody who, immodestly, has been a leader internationally in developing research on the topic of climate change and the risks currently and particularly in the future to human health. But the public discussion about climate change has got bogged down pretty much in the immediacies of the economic consequences, the impacts on industries and jobs, risks to physical infrastructure, concerns about iconic species, polar bears, Great Barrier Reef and so on, all very important. But we don't seem to have made the connections, connect the dots and realise that all of these sorts of changes ultimately, if not currently, present risks to the future of human health. Food supplies, fresh water supplies, stability of infectious disease patterns, protection against extreme weather events, and social stability, as a basis for well-being and reasonable mental health, as opposed to the consequences of displacement and disruption and conflict. So we don't seem to have got to the point of understanding the stakes we're really playing for with human-induced climate change. So it's increasingly seemed to me that it would be useful to look back and ask the big question about how humans have fared in the past in response to naturally occurring climate change. And there I'm a bit lucky because climate does vary naturally and has made a number of short-term and long-term fluctuations over the last 10,000 years. So there's an interesting record of that changing exposure to climate, and increasingly, as we move from the long distant past towards the future, quite a good record of human health outcomes. So I'll be attempting to put those together because it's an interesting story anyway, it's fascinating, but hopefully it will alert us to the great dependence that our societies everywhere and across time have to climatic stability. Most of the story that I'll be telling will be, as the title of the book implies, about food crises and famines, hunger, deaths, and infectious diseases. Those are the things that are most evident in the long historical record. If we go back a long way, we do find very interesting evidence at times of dramatic climatic reversals, as occurred about 11,000 years ago as we were warming, coming out of the last ice age and approaching this Holocene period that's prevailed with a reasonably stable climate over the last 10,000 years. But there was a major hiccup around 11,000 years ago with dramatic cooling, and that really disrupted the settlements that were starting to flourish in the Nile Valley. Suddenly the river flows declined, the supply of foods, fish, animals that were hunted, vegetation declined, and there was a shortage of food and a shortage of fresh water supplies. There was conflict, and it's evident in the archaeological studies that that conflict broke out widely and the number of settlements declined from about 20 to 4. That's a pretty dramatic effect on human health through warfare and bashing one another to death. There was also evidence of nutrition deficiencies in the skeletal remains. Of course, the question is, well, what are the implications for the future? And I will want to devote a certain amount of the book, maybe up to 1/3 of it, in which I then say, well, this is what we've learnt from the past. How does that provide an analogue for likely future experience? And in some ways I'll be able to say, well, yes, we can learn directly that societies are generally, depending on circumstances and resources, are pretty sensitive to rather small changes in climatic conditions. And in fact, we're now having to face a future in which the extent of change and the rate of change in the world's climate is actually likely to be rather greater than anything that I'm going to be able to study in the last 10,000 years. But nevertheless, that long history will give us a clue, and readers will want to know what it does mean for the future and how it should help us to reframe our thinking so that we understand that human well-being, health, survival, the stability of societies, the avoidance of conflict, are all very dependent on being able to maintain a climate that is within our comfort zone. And we're now on the brink of moving out of that. So this is rather an urgent project, I think, and I'm hoping the book will just contribute a little to bringing us to our senses and helping us understand the stakes we're playing for and taking the sort of immediate action that increasingly is seen as necessary.
I guess listening to Tony speak then reminds me that I don't think I ever finished a conversation with Tony that didn't end with me thinking that both the scale of the projects I should be working on should be bigger and my enthusiasm for succeeding should be greater. I think it's no understatement to suggest that Tony really did want to not only study but solve some of the biggest problems that our planet faces. And he was both... It's all right. It's my mum. He was ambitious enough, I think, to think that those problems were indeed solvable and that he had an important role to play in it. Yet he was humble enough to work with anybody else who he thought wanted to help as well. So on that note, we're just going to have a brief musical interlude, and then we're going to hear from Professor Sharon Friel. So we've got some wonderful students from the ANU Music School. Thank you. Thank you very much. As many of you know, music was a very important part of Tony's life. Our next speaker is Professor Sharon Friel, who is the Director and Professor of Health Equity at RegNet, the Regulatory Institution Network here at ANU. And she's also the Director of the Menzies Centre for Health Policy at ANU. And you just heard John Connor talk about Tony's work in the climate sphere, and obviously Professor Stanley talked a lot about his work in epidemiology, and now we're going to hear a bit from one of his close colleagues here at ANU. Again, there are so many different dimensions to Tony's life that, well, we're all a part of them, but only Tony and his family were the whole of them. So please, Sharon, if you'd come up.
Thank you. It's a real privilege to reflect and celebrate Tony's life, and I do just want to focus on three aspects. The first, as we've heard, is the vision of his work. So Amartya Sen wrote about having the freedoms to lead a life one has reason to value. Within this, he was evoking issues of people's personal capabilities, but highlighting how these are very strongly influenced by wider social conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age. Tony McMichael most certainly lived a life full of value. He had incredible inherent personal capabilities, but he fully recognised that his life course of a stimulating early childhood, high-quality education, financial affluence, family support, and a wide network of friends and colleagues enabled him to flourish. And he knew that not everyone had the same chances and supports in life that he had. And so in his research, he took on these issues of social justice and human well-being. And I think through great insight, he saw very early on that these were fundamentally linked to environmental sustainability, as we've heard. But in bringing together these three great contemporary issues of social justice, human well-being, and environmental sustainability, Tony's work challenged many dominant paradigms. His 1999 article in the American Journal of Epidemiology, which is entitled Prisoners of the Proximate, challenged epidemiologists to ask different questions. He pushed the health community, who stubbornly focus on the treatment of disease and health-related behaviours, to understand and act on the societal level factors that affect people's health. And then to cap it all, he blew open the dominant reductionist way of reasoning to show us that a whole-of-systems approach was needed to improve population health, especially if we are to address environmental change, particularly climate change, as a major driver of health and health inequities. My engagement with Tony around these issues was really mainly to do with the research on food systems, climate change, and health equity. So you might have guessed, I'm from the east end of Glasgow in Scotland, where deep-fried Mars bars and deep-fried pizzas are not uncommon in people's daily diets. And this was a constant source of amusement to Tony, but it also was a real reminder to him why his earlier work was so important. Instead of blaming the individual poor person for eating badly and giving them yet another leaflet on healthy eating, Tony's work investigated the wider food system, issues such as production, manufacturing, retail, that made these types of foods much more readily available, affordable, and socially acceptable compared to the healthier options. So I had the pleasure to work with him on these issues, and then particularly in later years when we were asking the questions of how climate change interacts with the food system to affect availability and price, but also, of course, how the food system contributes to environmental degradation through the relatively high levels of greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity loss and water use. And the work of Tony and colleagues sent shivers through the health and agricultural sectors when in 2007, their Lancet paper in 2007, They had the audacity to suggest that there should be a global contraction and convergence in animal product consumption, where they boldly proposed that there would be a global target of 90 grams per day, as that was the sort of the working target, and 50 grams, no more than 50 grams, coming from red meat, from ruminants. And you can imagine how that was received in different policy circles. Which leads me on to the second thing that I remember of Tony, which was absolute courage, and that's been reflected already. As I suggested, he takes on these big agendas, which means he took on the vested interests in the academy, in politics, in policy and in practice. But I think through leading by example, Tony really encouraged people to think big, be bold, be courageous, but be evidence-based and be gracious at all times. Although I think it was delightful to see him in recent years get really very rambunctious around the snail's pace of action on climate change and health. And my working with Tony was very serendipitous. So I was living in Ireland and at the time, and my partner wanted to move back to Canberra, and I said, "Oh, where's that?" Apologies. But I did say, there's this great epidemiologist in Canberra doing groundbreaking work on climate change and health, which of course was Tony. Let me go and have a chat with him. So there's me, arrives onto Tony's doorstep. He was the director of NSEF at the time and said, "This is what I do," which is sort of food systems and health equities. "Are there any positions?" "Yes," he said, as his executive assistant, who was wearing these white lacy hand gloves, poured tea into the lovely china cups. Colleagues are smiling, you'll remember. We didn't break any HR issues, I should say. There was a long story behind, yes, there is a position. And I tell this story really, because after working with him for a while, he said that part of the reason that he said yes was because I had the cheek to come into him cold and to challenge him on the issues of social equity in his climate change and health work. And I saw Tony, in his very quiet way, encourage people like me to be bold, to do research and advocacy work that really was trying to focus on making a difference. And if I can just reflect, or I'll read a little from a conclusion that we wrote together in a Lancet paper in 2008, all about this convergence between social equity, climate change and health agendas. And Tony really pushed me and other writers in that piece to be bold, I think, in thoughts and words. So let me read. So bringing the environmental health and equity agendas together via coherent policy at global, national and local levels will help mobilise the necessary political and popular support for a radical break with the complacent and compartmentalised attitude that still dominates much of the political agenda. More importantly, this convergence is an essential transformative step if humans are to survive across future generations equitably in a healthy, secure and peaceful manner. This moment should be seized. Otherwise, we may rehearse again the dismal historical experience captured in the words of Martin Luther King. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residues of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, "Too late." And so I come to my final reflection. I'll miss Tony for many reasons: his intellect, his tenacity in pursuit of transformative action to save the planet and improve people's lives, but also his enjoyment of different cultures and arts. And I'll also miss his ongoing tease of my Scottish accent. So I thought it was only fitting to finish with a little Scottish culture, which we do have. Many of you will know Auld Lang Syne, the song that's sung at New Year. I'm not going to sing, don't worry. The song that is sung at New Year when people join hands in friendship as they look forward to the new year ahead, and pledging that whatever challenges life may bring, that old friends will not be forgotten. Auld Lang Syne is in fact a poem that was written by the Scottish songwriter and social justice pioneer Robert Burns, and the lyrics, which I will read, "We'll tak a cup of kindness yet," refers to the tradition of raising a glass with goodwill, friendship, kind regard, and in remembrance of noble deeds. So in memory of Tony and his many, many noble deeds, in the words of Rabbi Burns, should old acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind, should old acquaintance be forgot and days of Auld Lang Syne, For auld lang syne, my dear, for auld lang syne. We'll tak a cup of kindness yet, for auld lang syne. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon, for that touch of Scottish culture, and I'm sorry we couldn't get the deep-fried Mars bars for afternoon tea. Our next speaker is Emeritus Professor Ian Lowe. Ian's Professor of Science and Technology at Griffith University, and I learnt today, first met Tony 50 years ago when they caused trouble on the National Student Union together, but Ian assures me that he never had a moustache like Tony's. So please welcome Professor Ian Lowe, AO.
Thank you very much, Richard. Chair, Tony's family, friends, it's a real honour to be invited to say a few words on this occasion. And I have to say, John Connor's already mentioned that Tony would have been delighted with the ANU's decision to divest some questionable assets. I think he would have been even more amused by the incandescent reaction from what could be called the forces of darkness to this decision. I found it difficult to work out how I could compress into 8 minutes what I would like to say about Tony's life and work. I reflected that the last time I was in this room was a dinner in the middle of a 2-day Festschrift 2 years ago, in which we spent 2 8-hour days plus an evening reflecting on some of Tony's contributions. And I think that's a measure of what a marvellous contribution he made. In our culture, where we almost always only reflect on the good people have done when they are no longer with us, I'm delighted we had that occasion to tell Tony personally how much his life and work has meant to so many of us. As Richard said, I first met Tony 50 years ago when we were callow young undergraduates around the table of the council of what was then the National Union of Australian University Students. And there were so many future stars around the table in those years that it was almost a galaxy of talent. Future politicians like Tom Roper, Chris Sumner, John Bannon, Gareth Evans, future jurists like Michael Kirby and Geoffrey Robertson, future distinguished academics like Alf van der Poorten and David Whedon, future journalists like Richard Carlton and Alan Hogan and Helen Muser, philanthropists and entrepreneurs like Robert and Janet Holmes à Court, future distinguished public servants like Peter Walensky, and publishers like Richie Walsh. But even in that galaxy of talent, Tony stood out for his wisdom, his vision, and his passion for social justice. And I was astonished to find he was studying medicine, because at that time the medical students at my university were, saving the presence of any of them, predominantly a very boring bunch, the sort of people who were prepared to memorise Gray's Anatomy, who could tell you where the sphincter of Oddi was, and not just tell you had 3 bones in your ear, but actually name them. And Tony was obviously so much older and wiser than me that I was astonished to find that he was just 1 month older than me. Clearly not much older, just much wiser. Under his chairmanship, the National Union of Students was transformed from a staid and constitutionally constrained body that only looked at the issues affecting students in their capacity as students, like fees and the provision of supplementary examinations and other topics of great global significance like that, to being engaged with the broader social and political issues that the students of the 1960s were concerned about, like apartheid in South Africa, like the conditions and treatment of the original Australians, and our participation in what people in Vietnam still call the American War. And he was not just a great organiser and leader, but he also had a wonderful sense of humour. I remember that the National Union was involved in helping to select participants in a program run by the US State Department called Far East Student Leaders, FESL, inevitably known as FESL. And when I was selected for that program, I got a note from Tony saying, "What do you get if you cross a ferret with a weasel?" In those days of paranoia in the intelligence agencies, there was also a predominant feeling that anyone who didn't support the American war in Vietnam had to be in the pay of the KGB, and those of us in student organisations were routinely followed and had our phones tapped and our premises done over. And I remember Tony was amused that the evidence that his premises had been surveyed were that a white knight was missing from his chess set. And he reflected that perhaps the intelligence agencies were trying to reposition themselves as white knights by stealing that particular piece. Others have commented on his great contribution to public health, and I think the evidence of that is all around us. His work on the impact on human mental development of lead, for example, in an era when lead was added to petrol and sprayed around the suburban streets, one molecule at a time, and was routinely emitted by smelters, so that, as Tony wickedly observed, the petrol industry and the lead industry obeyed the biblical injunction to give us each day our daily lead. His work on the health impacts of tobacco and more recently on ozone depletion and climate change, where he was not just a wonderful scientist, but also a very effective voice against misinterpretation, misinformation and obstruction by those who put commercial interests before public health. He was an obvious choice to lead the World Health Organization effort on health and climate change. And his 1993 book, Planetary Overload, which has already been mentioned, was a magisterial summary of the impacts of the Anthropocene. And if Tony had done nothing else, he would justly be internationally recognised for that piece of work alone. But I also wanted to mention the unseen but critical work that Tony did in ways that were rarely noticed, such as, for example, his efforts to encourage the setting up and development of Doctors for the Environment Australia, which is now an effective NGO getting information to general practitioners. And I warm to that when I see the notice about climate change on my GP's waiting room wall as evidence of how little actions can produce a large amount of good. I reflect on my most recent encounters with Tony. He was part of the organising group for the Joint Academies project, negotiating our future living scenarios for Australia to 2050, an extraordinary broad spectrum effort to reflect on possible futures for Australia and by implication to try and catalyse interest in shaping a better future than the world market might otherwise deliver for us. And only 4 months ago, we were together at an Academy of Science workshop for early career researchers in Brisbane, where he spent 3 days mentoring and encouraging the next generation of workers in this area. And I remember he urged me to get a copy of Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, with its dramatisation of the impacts of growing inequality, the inevitable and foreseeable consequences of English-speaking countries' fatally flawed flirtation with flat earth economics, but I digress. These examples all demonstrate Tony's passion for social justice, his profound commitment to creating a better world, and his willingness to mentor and help we lesser mortals. I'll always treasure his great intellect, his warm humanity, and his wickedly irreverent humour. And the very many conversations we had, not just about science and politics, but also about music, cricket, and other branches of the performing arts. He was truly a giant of his profession, as the many tributes that have flowed in from around the world testify. But he was also a lovely human being, truly, in the old phrase, a scholar and a gentleman. The world is clearly a better place for his wonderful work, and we are all better people for having known him. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. We're now going to have a number of reflections from a number of other people that were close to Tony. First up, we've got Hilary Bambrick.
Thanks, everyone. Following Professor Lowe is probably one of the hardest things I'll have to do today. Tony is the reason that I do the work that I do. I was an undergraduate studying human ecology when I came across Tony's book, Planetary Overload, which you've already heard mentioned a couple of times today. It was so clearly and convincingly written, and such a compelling call to arms. A few years later, when I was finishing my PhD, I discovered that Tony had taken up residence as the director of NSEF here at ANU. I nervously emailed him, asking if we might possibly meet. To my surprise, he said yes. I turned up, and rather disappointingly, he didn't seem the least bit scary, and he invited me to apply for a postdoc. Years later, in his speech at my farewell, he told everyone he only gave me the job because I had purple hair. Tony was my mentor, my colleague, and my friend. He supported my early academic career, gave me opportunities that I could never have had elsewhere. He fostered a working environment that was collegial and productive, and he never underestimated the value of a tea room conversation. Tony was a passionate, unrelenting political activist. He could also rally a crowd of academics and administrators like no one else, and he was a bottomless pit when it came to knowledge of the classics. He was also cheeky with an easy, ready wit. Above all, Tony was an intellectual powerhouse capable of theorising complex systems that spanned far more space and time than was decent. He approached these with a scientific rigour that would have made Galileo proud. Tony's causal thinking was far bigger than epidemiology had previously dared. Some of you may also know that Tony was a grandmaster of PowerPoint. He could distill massively complex ideas about human ecological systems into a single PowerPoint slide, laying bare each connection, each causal pathway, each feedback loop, by building up the diagram piece by piece, layer upon layer, explaining eloquently as he went. He didn't tolerate a poor PowerPoint presentation or an incomprehensible slide from anyone, and had very strict ideas on just how many slides it was reasonable to ask an audience to sit through. Okay. And he was a perfectionist, driven by detail. Once he put together a very simple slide on physical activity with a toggle animation as part of a lecture to medical students, confessing to me afterwards that it had taken him an entire long-haul flight to get the alignment right. Now, this made me wonder just how many long-haul flights he'd had to take just so he could put together one of his more complex slides on human ecological systems. Now, finally, most of us know Tony primarily through his work, but his other great love was his family. He was so proud of their accomplishments. To Judith, Anna, and Celia, thank you so much for sharing Tony with us. He's dearly missed by us all.
Next, we've got Johnathon Patz.
It's really a true honor to be at this event and share some of my reflections. I've worked with Tony for about 20 years, and by this point in this memorial, you already know why it is thanks to Tony McMichael that children are smarter from reduced lead exposures, that workers are healthier because of Tony's description and discovery of the healthy worker effect, and the world is aware that public health is a central issue regarding climate change, and that his scientific achievements and clarion call to action, particularly in his masterpiece, Planetary Overload, ranks alongside that of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. This is a rather formal affair for a brilliant, yet informal and humble scholar. So I left my sport jacket behind. However, I was downtown earlier today, and I stopped in at a barber shop, which I haven't done for a long time, and I got a haircut. If Tony was in the audience, he would call out and say, "Isn't that an oxymoron for you, Patz?" Tony had a great sense of humor, which I particularly appreciated. I recall a meeting in London when I mentioned something about low-hanging fruit, and as I just barely can see over the podium, Tony called out, "And for you, it has got to be really low-hanging." Tony was a dear friend and colleague. We shared many jogging trails together. We even strolled atop China's Great Wall. And he and Judith were such wonderful hosts, would always open their home. I could never stay in a hotel in London or Canberra because I would stay with them. And Tony introduced me to Vegemite and cricket, neither of which I liked then nor like now. Of course, there was a bit of quid pro quo because every time I visited, I'd have to bring this strange American drink, this cereal drink called Postum. And I don't know where he did live in North Carolina, so maybe he came upon liking to drink Postum. It has nothing to do with opossums, don't worry. Tony was a selfless and caring professor and a stellar role model. And in my own professorship, I always try to be like Tony and think about how he would behave. Though I could never be even 1/3 as smart as him, I could at least try. And he was a model for so many scientists and professionals through his lifetime of objective scientific inquiry combined with efforts from so many other people that he influenced. Tony has assured that we are gaining traction and turning society away from the precipice. I will always remember Tony McMichael as a brilliant mentor, a gifted teacher, a wonderful and humorous friend, and ultimately an inspiration for all of us. His teaching and his mission will absolutely live on, and while I'm on sabbatical this year, finishing up a book on climate change and public health, it's now, of course, dedicated to Tony McMichael. In 2 days, it will be Thanksgiving, where I'm from in the United States. It's a time when we consider what we are most thankful for. And for me, the answer is so simple. I'm grateful to have known and worked with Tony McMichael. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnathon. Next we have Melanie Walker.
I'm honoured to be here today on behalf of the Public Health Association of Australia, and I'm going to read a tribute that's been written by our Chief Executive Officer Michael Moore and our past President Professor Mike Daub, who are unable to be with us here today. Others today will rightly celebrate Tony's immense contribution to environmental change and global health. For this alone, he will be seen by generations to come as one of Australia's greatest public health scientists and leaders. It is our privilege on behalf of PHAA, the Public Health Association of Australia, to recall Tony's contribution to our organisation, the development of public health advocacy in Australia, and the role distinguished academics can play through advocacy based on meticulous research. Tony was a long-standing member and supporter of PHAA. He was PHAA President in 1988 and 1989, indeed the first PHA President to be elected by a vote of the total membership. He continued to support PHAA both before his departure for London and following his return. Until very recently, Tony was in regular contact with PHAA officers and with the CEO, offering advice and encouraging commitment across a wide range of health issues, but especially on climate change and health. Over many years, he has provided insight, understanding, mentoring, and suggestions in policy development, especially for PHAA's Ecology and Environment Special Interest Group. While he is, of course, best known for his work on climate change and global health, he was even before this well recognised as one of Australia's outstanding epidemiologists who contributed in many other areas, not least through his meticulous and painstaking work in chairing the NHMRC report on passive smoking that was so influential in supporting bans on smoking in public and other places. Tony's campaigning activities were always based on the certainty of sound science and a naturally courteous but incisive style, which made him all the more formidable as an advocate and his arguments all the more difficult to counter in any logical manner. We are proud to have known Tony as an icon for PHAA and public health more broadly, an immensely distinguished colleague, an advocate of the utmost integrity, a supporter and mentor to many others, and a leader whose impact on public health globally, as well as in Australia, will be felt in the decades to come. Thank you.
Thanks. Our last reflection comes from Dr. Liz Hanna, who's a senior fellow at the ANU, and I noticed that she sat on the NHMRC review panel into the health effects of wind farms. This week the Senate voted yet again to have an inquiry into that most dangerous of invention, the wind farm, and like John Connor, I think I'm not sure if it would have been fun or scary to be near Tony when he heard that yet another inquiry was to be held into that most lethal of devices. Please welcome Dr. Liz Hanna.
Thanks, Richard, and again with others, it is indeed an honour to be here. I need glasses because I'm so old I can't read. Tony, of course, was an exceptional human being, and it takes an exceptional human being to bring us all here today. And as we've heard, his list of achievements are legendary in many, many ways. And I think it's fair to say that Tony actually got more than his fair share of positive attributes, and he got them in spades, but he used them well. We've heard so much about his intellect, and he was a polymath. The breadth of his scope was vast. There's nothing shallow or superficial with Tony McMichael. He penetrated deeply into all manners, as we've heard, of intellectual, cultural, musical, and even those queer sporting pursuits, not something I share. He learnt very early, of course, that hospitals and the biomedical model played an overblown, but in reality a relatively small role in determining health status. So he turned towards health determinants, and notably the relationship between the environment, human health and well-being. But running with the pack? Not Tony, he was a trailblazer. He took up the gauntlet for the good fight in steering conservative institutions into recognising that climate change and environmental degradation are indeed human health issues, and without a healthy planet, quite simply, we do not exist. And so he pushed that line and was very effective in that. And he realised, of course, that policy was a major way and a major key, not only in his prolific scientific writings, but influencing policy was a way to actually get things done. And through this, he, as we've heard from Melanie and others, that he supported the PHA and my role when I was convener for 7 years of the Environmental Health SIG. He was also president of the Epidemiological Association. We've heard of his work with Doctors for the Environment. And he also supported my work and indeed the rest of my presidency and the work that we're doing in the Climate and Health Alliance. And so he's very, very much an ally in all those. And the point is, I mean, can we calculate now the collective good that this man actually brought for humanity? I mean, for example, if we could measure the IQ erosion that he avoided with his efforts in lead and all those other areas, I mean, actually putting a calculation on the impact that this man has had, would be something that I think he would take a challenge, and he would, apart from the fact his humility would prevent it, but it would be something that he'd relish to do. At NCEF, he built up what I understand is the world's largest and leading team in climate change and human health, and he brought to the ANU the Climate Change Adaptation Research Network, and I think he might have actually been successful in every competitive grant, NHMRC grant that he applied for. So an asset in many, many ways. In fact, my name for Tony was God. He was omnipresent. Barely a paper exists in the scholarly environmental health literature that does not refer to Tony and his works. And as a man, of course, he had an ego. You don't get to strut the world academic stage without having one. But his humility was palpable, and you could see him physically cringe when he was actually confronted by hero worship. And of course, that was not uncommon. So he had such a blessed set of personal characteristics, all crowded into one man, and they seemed to live in harmony. We miss the twinkle in his eye, his gentle, thoughtful persuasiveness, and the world is a better place because of him, and a poorer place now without him. He was, and his legacy lingers, one of humanity's greatest warriors. And we thank Judith and her family again for sharing the man we did love, Tony McMichael.
Thank you to all of those people who are brave enough to stand up and talk a little bit about how they felt and what they would like people to remember about Tony and what he's done. Our next speaker, of course, is the person to whom we are all most grateful that she's here today and is going to address us. Of course, I'm talking about Dr. Judith Healy, Tony's wife. It was once a commonplace to say that behind every good man was a good woman, but that kind of comment gets you tomatoes thrown these days. And I think those of you who know Judith know that she was not behind Tony, she was beside him, and perhaps even at times in front of him. Please welcome Judith Healy.
Well, thank you all for coming this afternoon to commemorate Tony. And many thanks to the Vice-Chancellor and to the Australian National University, to Tony's colleagues at the National Centre for Epidemiology and Population Health, and to my colleagues at the Regulatory Institutions Network. I miss Tony terribly, of course, and as do our daughters, Anna and Celia. And so do Tony's many friends around the world. And we've been grateful, tearful, even overwhelmed at times by the flood of letters, emails, tributes on blogs and obituaries in journals and newspapers. As we've heard this afternoon, people attest to Tony's kind and generous nature, to his extraordinary scholarship, and to his attention to the big public health issues of the day and those of the future. And as we've heard, Tony early on grasped the threats facing the health of populations and indeed the sustainability of civilizations if we continue on our trajectory in a warming world. And as we've heard from Tony himself in the podcast, he liked the challenge of looking at the big and interdisciplinary picture. He wanted to know what we can learn from the past in order to guide us in the present and future. So he was keen to research the impact, often disastrous, of significant climate change on communities in past ages around the world. And to look at what people and their rulers, how people and their rulers responded, often too late, it seems. His latest and last book will be published, we hope, next year. So Tony was indeed a remarkable man, and he was and is greatly missed and loved. Thank you.
I first met Tony in 2003, I think. I moved to Canberra in 2000 for 18 months, 14 years ago. Tony was on the board of the Australia Institute, which I now lead. When I first met Tony, I can't remember if he asked or I volunteered that I was an economist. And he said, "Oh, are you a good one or a bad one?" And I said, "I don't know." what's a bad one? He said, well, take a leaf out of the doctor's book. Do no harm. Not bad advice. I run a very strange organisation. It's a think tank. What the hell is that? We do research. I employ researchers, but we want to participate actively in public debates. We want to change people's minds about things. Some of our work is sitting in front of computers playing with big spreadsheets, and some of our work is talking to tabloid radio, and some of our work is spending time in Parliament House trying to convince parliamentarians to vote for better rather than worse policy. And being on the board of the Australia Institute, as Tony was for many years, it's a very strange job because my KPIs are a little bit hard to define. Tony never struggled with that. I've been quite blessed with a good board during my tenure, but Tony, more than any other board member, I think, felt quite passionately that you could tell impact when it was there, and I think he thought he could tell BS when it was there. Because Tony wanted to change the world, and I think he thought that organisations like the Australia Institute, like the Climate Institute, like the Doctors for the Environment, like his transformation of student politics, I don't think I've ever met anyone who coped with ambiguity as well as Tony, while still being able to have that laser-like focus on detail and on precision. It's a remarkable combination. So thank you, Judith. I first met Judith when she wrote a paper for the Australia Institute on the upside of population ageing. I don't know if you remember that. Judith was the first person to kind of, well, at least say to me, oh, why are we worried about ageing? Isn't that what the health budget's for? Changed my mind like that. It's brilliant. So it's now my honour to thank you all for coming, encourage you out to join us for some fried Mars bars. And I think, what would Tony say if he was here? I think he'd want us all to keep working, keep smiling, and keep helping each other. Thank you.